A much anticipated decision comes down tomorrow. Special Rapporteur David Johnston will reveal whether or not he thinks a public inquiry is needed to investigate foreign interference in Canada. Johnston was tapped by this Prime Minister to make this decision following a string of media reports detailing alleged Beijing-backed meddling in Canadian elections. As we wait for Johnston's decision, we'll turn to someone who has some first-hand experience with a public inquiry. Marian Buller served as Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Ms. Buller, you've seen some of the reporting on this issue. Do you believe we need a public inquiry to investigate some of the allegations of foreign interference in Canada?
You know, that's a tough question to answer, and I don't mean to be evasive. But, you know, it's a big question because there are a lot of issues and a lot of considerations. Now, having said that, I think we have to remember that public inquiries in Canada can be very expensive. They can be very time-consuming, and they can be an opportunity for governments to sidestep an issue until a final report is issued. So I'm reluctant to second-guess the Special Rapporteur, David Johnston, but it seems like there's some political will to have a national inquiry.
You know, do you think it should zero in? I know you're kind of on the fence, but if there is, you know, some of the criticism sometimes of public inquiries is that they're maybe too sweeping and there's too many issues at hand. Do you think that it's better for a public inquiry, if Johnston does recommend one, to kind of zero in on an issue in particular, say Beijing's alleged meddling, as opposed to maybe going down the road of investigating all possible foreign interference? What's your take on that?
Well, I hate to second guess David Johnston because he's seen documents and other information that none of us have seen, or as I understand, have seen. But, you know, it's always better to have a very narrow focus or a very specific focus on what the inquiry is going to look into for a couple of reasons. First of all, it has to do with public expectation. The terms of reference have to be very precise so that the public knows what to expect as an outcome, so that the public knows what the inquiry can look into and what the inquiry cannot look into, so that we're not expecting more than what the public inquiry can produce. Also, the terms of reference for a public inquiry have to be very clear in terms of what documents can be compelled, what witnesses can be compelled, what are the issues concerning privilege and confidentiality, and balance those with the need for protecting national security. So focus, clarity, transparency, but a clear understanding of what can and cannot be done. Really important.
The MMIWG inquiry was a bit of a rocky road for you and the other commissioners. You know, it took 9 months to get the inquiry up and running from the time it was called. You've said yourself you don't believe the federal government was really taking it seriously from the very beginning. Do you fear an inquiry into foreign interference could face some of the same challenges that you had?
Well, we faced a lot of challenges, and I don't want to relive those. Any national inquiry or federal inquiry, for that matter, faces challenges. But I think now perhaps governments have learned, not just the federal government, but provincial and territorial governments too, that when you call an inquiry, you have to have the infrastructure there on day one. Otherwise, too much time gets lost. So let's hope that the federal government, anyway, if they decide to go ahead, learned that you have to be up and ready with infrastructure on day one.
And there's no real indication that they are at this point. But given, you know, undoubtedly there will be challenges with this format. It wasn't just your inquiry that had some issues. Other ones in the past have faced similar restraints. But it can be a useful process, right? I mean, the Liberal government initially kind of said there doesn't need to be a public inquiry. There's already a parliamentary committee digging into this issue. Why do we need to call on an inquiry? But a commission of inquiry has more power, right? And it could ultimately be a very useful tool to getting to the bottom of what's gone on here. Or is it fair to say it's just a fool's errand?
Oh, you know, you've raised a lot of very interesting issues. Public inquiries have a very important function. well, actually, they have several very important functions, but one of them is public education about the issue at hand. So I could foresee a public inquiry into foreign interference, providing public education about just exactly how our electoral system works in Canada, for example, or how it doesn't work in Canada. So that there's a huge public education piece to a public inquiry, hence the name. Now, in terms of access to documents, we know from witnesses who have already appeared in front of the House committee that they're saying that a public inquiry probably wouldn't get any more information than what's already been before the committee. So, it's doubtful. I don't know. I'm reluctant to speculate on whether a public inquiry could get more information from the federal government and elsewhere about alleged foreign interference into our electoral system. That's a tough question because, of course, there's an awful lot of law that surrounds public inquiries, and access to documents, full disclosure, public interest in transparency has to be balanced in this case anyway against national security. So what would actually come about in the end, maybe David Johnston will have the answer to your question.
At the very least, I guess it could focus the public's mind on an issue, right? Because this would be a very public inquiry. There'd be lots of reporting on it, as you say. People could learn more about this interference issue. Much of the reporting about the Beijing-backed alleged meddling, is about Canadian elections, right? And the next federal election is scheduled for 2025. It could obviously happen sooner because we're in a minority parliament. But many people say Canadians need to have answers to these allegations before they head to the polls. We need to get to the bottom of this before the ballot boxes are actually rolled out across this country. As someone who led a major inquiry, you face some significant time restraints. Do you think it's even possible to get this inquiry off the ground, do all that substantive work, and have it ready by 2025, a final report?
That's the question, isn't it? Could this inquiry be up and running and produce a final report well in advance of October 2025? By my calculations, the report would have to be issued sometime in the summer of 2025, which means 2 years. So if the government decided that federal government wanted to decided to have an inquiry, by my calculation, they would have to have that up and running by September of 2023. And that would give them not a heck of a lot of time, but it would give them some time to do some, I hope, very good work. But, time is of the essence, and the clock's ticking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tight turnaround. This issue has become so polarizing. It's highly partisan. David Johnston's credibility has been attacked in the process. Do you see that posing a problem to a substantive investigation? Do you think all that public heat is really something that could detract from the main issue?
Oh, the public heat and the main issue. I think that the coverage in the media, the criticism of David Johnston, all is adding to the public's pressure and political pressure for some form of public inquiry. But again, as I've said, David Johnston has had access to materials that none of us have.
Right. Okay.
So we have to go with his recommendations. But certainly there's from the opposition's perspective, a political will for a federal inquiry.